First term, old regime. Somebody, what is it? Yeah, okay, but that's kind of vague. It's a social of when, of how, and why. It's you're just saying kind of the most basic information about it. It was the social order before what other event? Yeah, the French Revolution is the old regime, right? It's the old social order. How was the social order divided? Into estates. How many were there?
3.
There was 3. Good. Who was in the first estate? The church. The second was the nobility, and the third was everybody else. It's not just peasants, literally everybody. Everybody who wasn't a noble or of the church. So basically, the majority of all people, right? Now, other than simply being king of France, what can you tell me about Louis XVI? That's not untrue. What type of king was he?
He was like quiet and like awkward.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he was socially inept. It's kind of a bad thing to be socially inept and the leader of a country, right? What about Marie Antoinette? What can you tell me about her? Oh, yeah. I ain't saying she's a gold digger. Yep. But yeah, she liked to spend the money. Now, that being said, were Louis and Marie, were they bad people? No. But they were not really good leaders.
He believed everything that people told him to do.
Yeah, exactly. He just went with whatever the next person he just talked to said, and because it was surrounded by the first and the second estate, they stayed in power. Add into that the Estates General. What was the Estates General? Right. It was basically their legislative assembly. It was a meeting of the different social orders. And what was the problem with the Estates General? Yeah.
The first estate and the second estate were always together, so they always voted.
Yep. Each got one vote because the first and the second estate were part of the old regime. They always voted together and overruled the third. So change couldn't happen. So instead, the third estate formed what? When they got fed up with it? The National Assembly. Good. Who decided to write a constitution and make France republic? Make them a republic. Now, of course, how did Louis respond to this? He didn't want him to do it, but he wasn't really confrontational, so basically he just locked the doors of the assembly building, yeah? So where did they meet instead? A tennis court where they met and basically decided to forge a new government, thus sort of beginning the French Revolution.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So like for example, like for the tennis court oath would be like where the revolution started.
Yeah, but the thing is, you're not going to be filling out anything quite like that. Remember, this is multiple choice. So more often than not, I'm going to say something to the effect of either which event began the French Revolution or what have you. Now, the problem is that there's a tricky question there, and I'm not going to ask it, I'm going to tell you because that would be evil, and ask you which event began the French Revolution and put on there both the tennis court oath and the storming of the Bastille. Because depending on who you ask, the revolution really began at either of those 2 points. But that is certainly something I could ask. Okay, the Great Fear. Please understand, because we go over to the Reign of Terror, and people get that confused a lot. And so let's kind of analyze what each is differently. The Great Fear was sort of this widespread outbreak of violence amongst the peasants who went and burned down noble houses, stole grain, all that kind of stuff, in response to the famine that was breaking out in France during the first phase of the French Revolution. The Reign of Terror was the second phase and lasted a year. That was where the Committee for Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, began executing anybody they saw as an enemy of the revolution, which basically was mostly peasants who were rebelling because of hunger. So we're talking about two different times, so don't get them confused. Okay? Alrighty. A legislative assembly. You guys know the different branches of government. What are the three branches of government?
Legislative,
Begins with an E. X. I heard somebody say it.
executive.
Yes. Executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The judicial branch's job is to make certain that laws that are passed are, one, constitutional, or based on the Constitution, and two, to make certain that the rules are basically being followed accordingly. Not to be confused with the executive branches, who are to make certain that Congress and the judicial branch are following the rules. In addition, the executive branch is sort of like the leader. You know, they're kind of setting the stage, but the legislative body is the one who makes laws, right? So the legislative assembly, what we're talking about, is basically a democratic process of developing laws, right? So basically, France is going to have several different legislative assemblies, depending on how you organize it. Now, émigrés. Do you remember who they are? Émigrés were nobles who fled France during the Revolution. Basically, they saw where things were going, took all their money, and fled the country. The idea being to escape the violence and the devastation going on during the Great Fear. And when they left, they brought horror stories with them about how terrible all of the revolutionaries were. You remember that pamphlet I showed you with the really creepy-looking people in the guillotine and the world on fire? Right? That's the kind of thing that the émigrés were telling the other nations was going on. Meanwhile, back in France, there was two main political parties, the Sans-Culottes and the Jacobins. Which group was the working class, the actual laborers? The Sans-Culottes. Sans means without. Culottes was the socks. They weren't fancy pants. They were everyday common Joe. The Jacobins were the educated middle class. Right? What is a guillotine? Yep, it's a machine that cuts off people's heads. It's a mechanical headspin. Culotte means basically fancy socks. So without fancy socks. Well, no, it's actually the socks, but the reason the fancy pants, what that refers to is the knee breeches that were worn by the aristocracy, they ended right about here. And so you'd wear these nice stockings and they'd be done up with garters and everything else like that because that was styling, right? And so they weren't actually referring to the pants, but at the same time, they kind of were, so. That's why I say fancy pants history. Remember that. All right, Robespierre was the architect of the Reign of Terror. He was in charge of France during the Reign of Terror. And there's a lot of other things about him that you can know. For instance, he was a Jacobin. He was a firebrand, meaning that when you talk about politicians, right, you've got the politicians who are classy, who are laid back and sort of, want to work with everybody. And then you've got the firebrands, the ones who are like, we're going to change it and you're going to deal with it, or, those very angry, and those are firebrands, right? That's Robespierre, right? He was a call to action, and he believed the best way to control the people of France was fear. If you make people afraid, they won't step out of line. And to some extent, that's true. However, what really drives people to rebel isn't fear, it's lack of opportunity. When you have bad things happen and people can't do anything to change them, they will find a way to change. If they can't change themselves, they'll change the system. So that's revolution. So the Reign of Terror lasted 1 year and ended with the death of Robespierre. And from there, we have a shift into a very small, by comparison, third phase. I guess it's actually one of the longer ones in truth. It's just uneventful by comparison. But the third phase of the French Revolution. And then we move into the fourth, where Napoleon Bonaparte comes into power. So let's ask the question, how was Napoleon able to gain control of France?
His military skills.
Partially, yes. Technically speaking, he launched what's called a coup d'etat, which is basically a military takeover of the government. But the thing is, he also had the popular support of the people using plebiscites, which were yes or no votes. He used the plebiscites to use his popularity to become emperor. That's the thing you have to understand. He was popular because he was successful militarily. So he used that to his advantage. Now, there's a lot of changes that he ends up doing in France. Number one, of course, as far as the terms are concerned, he established lycées, which were public schools. Then he signed a concordat or agreement with the Pope, thus ending sort of the religious feud that was going on. Even though technically he had a non-secular government, he weakened the power eventually of the church. He technically set aside these fights that were going on. He established the Code Napoleon, which was his set of laws based on the Enlightenment, and spread that around to other countries. And finally made France an empire that stretched across all of Europe. So basically, by the time he's at his height of power, he has all of Europe locked down. The only really power that can resist him are Russia and England. And England he tries to subdue by an invasion where he is defeated at the Battle of Trafalgar. You guys remember Trafalgar, where Lord Nelson fought against him and actually died in the battle but became a national hero? And then, when he invaded Russia, how many of his 240,000 troops actually made it out alive? 10,000. Yeah, exactly. 10,000 made it out alive. So eventually he was defeated at two battles, which were what? And what? Well, we already did Trafalgar, but what other two? One begins with an L, the other with a W. Leipzig and Waterloo. And technically the first one is the Battle of Nations at Leipzig, so we'll just go Leipzig and Waterloo. So he's defeated, and we have to basically rebuild Europe afterwards. So what happens there? Well, the Allied Nations, the Alliance of Nations, meets at Vienna, as well as the newly appointed King of France, where they're going to discuss what to do about France. And one of the guys, basically, I forget how you pronounce his name, it's Metternich or something like that. Anyways, he's a politician who wants to see three things happen. Number one, he wants to see things go back to the way they were before the revolution. Now, he's going to basically not get that one. Two, he wants to see a restoration of the balance of power. And three, he wants to see a restoration of the legitimate monarchs of Europe. He gets the other two. So first of all, dealing with legitimacy. A legitimate monarch is one who is a descendant of the monarch who came before them. Usually a direct heir, but not always. Napoleon screwed that up, and he killed a lot of monarchs. In addition, some monarchs just disappeared because of the chaos after the fact. In some cases, in the case of like France, they had to find cousins and things like that. But eventually they tried to restore the legitimacy. In some cases, we had whole new families come into play. Next, restoring the balance of power. In order to do that, they had to literally change the map of Europe. For instance, Germany went from being like 100 different states to being 5. Right? The new alliance is to surround France with strong power so that if this ever happened again, they would face backlash. And then thirdly, they established the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe was basically an assembly. It's sort of like a predecessor to the United Nations. The idea was to have the nations come together and talk out their differences so that they could prevent a war from happening. And that actually worked for about 100 years. The Concert of Europe actually held the balance of power more or less in play in Europe. And of course, the balance of power is simply maintaining that there wouldn't be one major power in Europe, okay? So they try to do that, and that's basically going to hold until World War I. Now, why that happens, we'll get to later. But ultimately, they formed this alliance together to prevent this. Make sense? Now, let me start eliminating some words up here for you. Some ones that I'm probably not going to be asking you questions. All right? So first and foremost, understand that when I start looking at questions like this, I'm going to be looking at things that I spent more of my time on. Because I'm going to be honest, I like questions like, of the 420,000 troops that left with Napoleon, how many made it out alive? 240,000. You know, that's a question I would ask. Okay. Metternich, give up. I'm not going to talk about it. Holy Alliance, that's one. Legitimacy, Constitution. Constitution of Europe, profit. Congress of Vienna, almost done. Although I would draw your attention here, because one of the easiest questions in the world to ask you is, where did the Allied nations meet to decide the fate of Europe? Vienna. Yeah, right. So knowing where it happened, big deal. Trafalgar, I absolutely talked to you guys about that, so that might get 2 questions, some fashion. Code Napoleon, again, and there's a couple different ways I could actually ask Code Napoleon. For instance, I could ask you what ideals it's based on, that would be Enlightenment. I could ask you how it spread the ideals of the Enlightenment, all kinds of different angles, something like that. Otherwise, I think we're in pretty good shape for what I would ask you guys on this. Because all the rest of these are pretty basic, easy questions to ask you. I will say this as well. Coming over to here, know who's in each one. Because that's 3 separate questions I can ask you. You know, put the 4 different classes. Who was in the, you know, this class was in which of the 3? This class was in which of the 3? This class, you know, that's stupid easy for me to ask. And if you don't know, it can really do damage to you. But if you do know, it's the easiest question in life, right? So remember, number 1 is church. Number 2 is nobility. Number 3 is everybody else, right? So, for instance, if I said, which of the 3 were the Jacobins part of, which say were they part of? 3. Yeah, remember, that's you got to think about it, because they are not noble. Yes, they're very wealthy and powerful, but they're not noble. And that is a tremendous distinction for these people at this time. Not so much for us, because we don't really have nobility, right? But for them, it was absolutely a difference. So the Jacobins and the Sans-Croix were both part of the Third Estate. So we might think, well, why didn't they get along afterwards? Because remember, just because you were part of the state didn't mean you had anything else in common. I mean, the peasants, the working class, and the middle class are all part of the Third Estate. The majority of people were, yet they didn't really get along. Okie dokie. Any questions? Yeah. Yes, it's just how you word it. Most of the time, I've seen it worded as the Code Napoleon, but I think it's actually your book is the Napoleon. Okay. Right. Concordance basically is another word for alliance, right? And this is actually something that's going to be a big deal later on, because an alliance between nations isn't necessarily common knowledge. I mean, sometimes it is. Like, for instance, if you have the National Assembly getting together, right? Well, not really national, it's the nation. If you have, like, for instance, a meeting of the Concert of Europe, and you have 2 nations sit next to each other, that's indicative that they're in alliance together. But you might also have people sending messages to each other underneath the table and saying, like, you know, I got your back if war breaks out, you got my back, and forming these agreements. So whenever a war does break out, you know, we're fighting over here, and she pulls you into the war, And I've only heard of it, suddenly we've got all these different secret treaties coming out. So if you're engaging a war with somebody, you got to be careful because you don't know how many alliances they necessarily have, right? In fact, there's actually a board game, I think it's called Alliance or something like that. And basically, it's sort of like this. It's where like each person like takes a nation, but one of the turns is secret meetings, where you get to meet with different groups and basically discuss elements of treaties and things like that. But the rules actually say like you can do whatever you want to choose. It's like, for instance, it's totally within the rules of the game to like be listening at the door or to record conversations with blackmail each other and all this kind of stuff. Like it's an evening's entertainment, and you get like super like, oh my god, you know, kind of things like that. Actually, in college, a couple friends played it for like a month. Like they had the board set up in part of the dorm, and just basically they would make these, and like there'd be stuff coming out like, you know, from the first week of the game and all this stuff, and like people setting up alliance thing. It's really freaking like nerve-wracking because you never really know what's going to happen. The thing is that paranoia is one of the reasons that we get World War I. It's set up now to maintain the balance, but maintaining the balance is going to be even harder as some of nationalism sets in. Anyways. Okay, yes ma'am. Yes, I removed that. Basically, blockade, well, that really has to deal with this Trafalgar, if you really get down to it. And kind of what happens after the fact, everything else like that. Because basically, after Trafalgar, the only way that Napoleon could think to hurt Britain economically is by blockading them. England does the same thing. Of course, here's what really would matter. What other war was caused by Trafalgar? The War of 1812. We fought against England because of their blockade. So, you know, they kind of continues on. But it's all tied together. Make sense? Fantastic. Okay, does anyone have any other questions? Because this is pretty much everything you're going to need to know for the test come Friday. Now, you guys all got the essays, I presume. The first one being on basically how was Napoleon defeated by geography with some battles. And then 2 was on, what's the second one? Oh, right. Why was Napoleon significant? That's right. Thank you. Okay, so that's that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording so you guys can get that on YouTube. I'm not sure how good the sound quality is going to be because the microphone's right here and I was over there for quite a lot of it. But at least it's something. And then you guys can have that.